Under capitalism, conservation, efficiency, frugality is not necessarily a virtue. People don't want you to buy the minimum number of shirts that you might need. They don't want you to buy the minimum number of shoes that you might wear. Look at food also. If you go to restaurants, about half of all the food that restaurants buy or serve is thrown away. So energy is not so different. We're throwing away energy the same way we throw away food in a restaurant or in our refrigerator. So some people estimate that the total efficiency of the system, from my mining a hunk of coal to the illumination I use to read a book, may be still only in the range of 5 to 10%. I sometimes say technology must change because the human brain won't. One needs to be careful not to push people to do things they don't want to do. Carpooling, in principle a nice idea, is almost always slower. Now, it may only add 10 minutes, 15 minutes a day to your travel time, but when you multiply that times 220 days a year that you work, in fact, it becomes something that's really stealing from you. A lot of the ideas that people have proposed for behavioral changes don't work because finally people, they want convenience. If the manufacturers of light bulbs or of cables or of turbines generating electricity can come up with more efficient products that they sell, that's better often than trying to convince people to buy fewer tomatoes at the grocery store.
Does it matter? I mean, what I do individually, if I have a compact fluorescent bulb over an incandescent or an LED even, does it really matter in the bigger scheme of things?
Well, this is the question of wholesale versus retail. And of course, both matter. Obviously, if a big company like General Electric or Rolls-Royce can make a turbine that's more efficient, that generates an enormous amount of power, it's good for a utility to buy that more efficient motor. At the same time, if I'm using 150-watt light bulbs where I could use 75 watts, or if I'm using incandescent bulbs where I could be using LEDs, I'm multiplying the demand. I'm multiplying what the system needs to create. So if end users can, through efficiency and also through changes in behavior, can divide the demand that's finally needed, then we need to generate less in the first place. Electrochemistry in some ways seems stuck. We really haven't had revolutionary ideas. Batteries, in order to store a lot of power, are still very large and very heavy, and thereby shoot themselves in the foot, because if a battery is very heavy, then you need to use a lot of the energy to transport the battery itself.
Right.
The genius of batteries in recent years has been for low power applications, but we haven't come up with high power batteries that store large amounts of energy and can be recharged very quickly. This is another of the problems with the batteries for the electric cars. Recharging them will take hours, so it's fine if you're willing to plug them in overnight.
Right.
At your home, but if you run out of energy at a gas station, you don't want to sit there for 2 hours.
Right.
Even though most people only typically travel, say, 25 miles, 50 miles, somewhere in people's primitive minds is this idea they need to be able to go 200 miles.
If you didn't have to move a battery, why can't we put giant batteries under every wind turbine and just store the electricity for when it's needed? What prevents that?
Well, that is one of the ideas. Obviously, the wind only blows part of the time, even in the windiest places on Earth, and often it blows at night when the demand for electricity is low. So for the so-called renewables like wind to succeed, there needs to be energy storage. But if one has to add to the cost of every wind turbine also a large battery which will need to be replaced, then that lifts the cost of the system.
So there's an economic cost as well as potentially an environmental cost of disposal. And
yes, well, the materials that go into batteries are still not nice. Of course, lead acid batteries that are in your automobile We all know what tight systems exist for recycling those, and you would never open up your lead acid battery on your suburban lawn and dump out the contents. Coal is doomed, and if I were energy czar in the U.S., China, the few other countries that matter the most, I would simply shut down the coal industry or introduce, say, a 5-year phased shutdown of the coal industry, creating the requirement thereby that the generators replace that power. In fact, what would happen would be a massive substitution of natural gas, because that's what can be built quickly and economically. I think it's time to face up to the need to put the coal industry to sleep.
Some people are concerned about particularly natural gas as a limited resource. You see that as a risk, Jesse?
Personally, I think we live in a world of methane abundance. In recent years in the United States, there's been lots of news about vast amounts of natural gas in shales, so-called shale gas. There have also been more and more discoveries of gas very deep. Most of the wells around the world, the oil and gas wells, are, let's say, 5,000 feet deep. We can drill much deeper than that, and people who are drilling to 10, 15, 20,000 feet on the continents are continuing to find very large deposits of gas. Equally important, offshore, particularly on the so-called continental margins or slopes that surround every continent, between about 600 feet deep and 10,000 feet deep, we are finding ribbons of natural gas, of methane, leaking out of the sediments and signaling to us that there are very, very large amounts of natural gas deep offshore. I think at least for the next 100 years, I think there's ample natural gas for Earth and for humanity, and natural gas is twice as good, twice as efficient, twice as clean, even more so than coal, and say 50% cleaner than oil. So simply switching our electric power generation from coal to natural gas leads to big gains in cleanliness and efficiency. The great thing about coal and even better oil and even better natural gas is they're compact, and you can get a lot of kilowatts out of a small area. And then finally, of course, the revolution came in the 1930s with atomic power, the power of the nucleus, which is 1,000 times more compact, maybe even 10,000 times more compact. You need only an aspirin of raw material to power a community rather than immense wood piles or huge mines of coal. If you visit China or India, you see that the future of humanity on Earth is enormous, dense cities, hundreds of them. So how can you power these? Well, you can only power them with sources that themselves are compact, and that finally pushes for, I think, for methane and for nuclear energy.
But even nuclear can't last forever, can it? It has to have a feedstock.
Well, there's uranium in seawater. You can
Yeah.
filter uranium out of seawater and you'd have enough for 1,000 years, which is a long time. People have worried about, is there enough uranium? First, the discoveries of uranium continue to be, the estimates of the resources of uranium continue to be large. Second, the use of the uranium in power plants has become more efficient. So we're getting more kilowatts out of the same hunk of uranium. And we can reprocess and recycle the uranium as well. There are concerns that might lead to easier proliferation of nuclear weapons, but it can also be handled in ways where we make proliferation very difficult and at the same time allow the reuse. Also, there are ideas for different cycles for nuclear power. There's interest now in thorium, which is comparable to uranium, but one can burn up, say, 50% or even 80% of a hunk of thorium, whereas typically with uranium, we might be burning up only, let's say, 5% of it.
Okay.
But the real revolution in nuclear power, in my mind, will come when we use it to do something in addition to boil water.
Right.
Basically, we have these immensely sophisticated machines boiling water to make electricity. The greatest failure of technology and engineering in the energy system in 10,000 years is the development of energy storage. Basically, you can store water behind a dam, but batteries don't work very well. It's very hard to store energy, especially electricity. But the great exception to that can be the manufacture of hydrogen, another energy gas, which you can keep in tanks or maybe even keep as metallic hydrogen. And nuclear power plants can manufacture hydrogen in addition to boiling water to make electricity. So that's to me, the real revolution to watch for in nuclear energy. I think in the fuels for mobility, the big change over the next 40, 50 years will be finally from petroleum to hydrogen. I think the vehicles of the future will have fuel cells using hydrogen to feed them. The cars will also have batteries, small batteries to recover energy when braking. So I think the future car isn't a big battery, as many people think. I think the future car motor is a big fuel cell and a small battery. Fuel cells have the advantage that they can be very efficient finally, 70% or so. So I think in the long run, the fuel cells may well win out over the internal combustion engines.
Give us a feel for the time frames for that.
I'd say in about 10 years, the fuel cells will start to be important. I think first we'll have an unfortunate experience the next few years with so-called electric cars as people explore the large battery route and encounter frustrations, and the fuel cells will meanwhile improve and start to develop their market. I think by 2080, 2100, we'll have an economy that's essentially entirely electricity and hydrogen.
Another option people are looking at is putting liquids from biofuels into vehicles. Thoughts on that? What do you see there?
For 10,000 years, humanity has been extending itself into nature. The idea that every car should have a pasture, the way that every horse used to have a pasture, is retrograde and crazy to me. There are 1 billion motor vehicles in the world. The land is too precious, both to produce food and as habitat for the rest of nature, for animals, birds, plants, to grind it all up and ferment it and put it into the tanks of cars. The amount of land you need per vehicle is just awful. So we basically need all the land.
And you're not talking about food for fuel, you're talking about for cellulosic, any kind of?
Yes, doesn't matter. All the feedstocks. First, the cellulosic ethanol doesn't exist today. It's arm waving. But if you take corn or soybeans, which do exist today, and turn those into biofuels, the ratios are just unacceptable from an environmental point of view. Renewables are not green. Some of the renewables may be renewable, the wind and the sun, but they're not green. And the main reason is the watts per square meter that they produce. So one needs immense amounts of land for wind. For example, one would need an area the size of Connecticut covered with windmills to power New York City. If you love wind, you better love transmission, because every windmill has to have a cable. It can be on the surface or you can dig a trench. It's an expensive digression which will cause some harm to nature and will cause harm to the public purse. Private investors won't put much money into it, so I don't think it'll have that much effect on private companies. I want the energy system of the future to fit inside the footprint of the energy system of today. In fact, I want it to shrink.
Smaller.
So I'm not against a more powerful power plant, but I want you to build it within the footprint of the power plant you have today. And in fact, that can be done. A natural gas power plant today can produce 5 times the kilowatts of an existing coal-burning power plant in the same acreage in Texas. So I'm not against more energy, but I think we should be reducing the footprint of the energy system in nature.
So you're really concerned about the surface impact.
Habitat. I'm
Yeah.
concerned about. I'm a habitat-oriented green. I think I look at life and the loss of biodiversity, the shrinking populations of so many forms of life, the difficulty, the habitat destruction in the oceans and on land, and I want to stop it. I want to not just stop it. I want to reverse it. I want more land for nature.